Imagine, a podcast series by Imagine Theatre.
Hello again, I hope you're well as the countdown to Panto 2021 continues. Welcome to episode 13 of this series from one of the UK's biggest producer of pantomime and children's theatre.
For more information, go to their website at www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.
If you've missed the previous episodes, then my name is Martin Ballard, and so far I've taken you behind the scenes at Imagine Theatre. We've met directors, choreographers, lighting designers and some of the stars of Imagine Theatre shows. As an example, in episode 12 I spoke to the Scottish television and theatre actress, star of a number of sitcoms and children's television programmes, from Rabsy Nesbitt and Still Game to Me Too, Jane McCarry. But don't worry, if you missed any of the previous episodes, they are still available to download. Now this time, in episode 13, my guest is the director, Associate Professor of Acting at Staffordshire University and Artistic Director of the Mitchell Arts Centre in Stoke-on-Trent, Robert Marsden. How are you, Rob?
I'm very well, Martin. It's wonderful to be here.
Now, before we talk about the many aspects of your incredible career, let's talk about your early influences. For some, it might be a school show or going to see panto or some form of theatre as a child. When were you first aware of theatre?
Do you know, it was exactly that. It was seeing theatre in my primary school days, and I've got three clear memories. One is a school's tour of Aladdin that came to our school hall. And I remember being absolutely scared by Abanazar, absolutely frightened by this person in a different costume, looking completely different and shouting at us. And I was absolutely enthralled. But I do remember that very clearly because it also taught me around that I was scared of the baddie, but I didn't want to leave. And that taught me a lot, I think. But I was taken to the theatre quite a lot as a child, and I've got two other really clear memories, Martin. One is the Vanessa Ford production of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe that toured for years and years. I love that story. Again, going to another world, probably why I love pantomime. You disappear off into another world. And again, I remember seeing the lamppost flying in. And I thought, that's incredible, that's fantastic. How does that work? How does that happen? So that hooked me. And I have another memory of seeing, not a pantomime, but the Christmas play version of Cinderella at the New Vic Theatre in Newcastle-under-Lyme. And it was Chris Martin directed it. And they went back to the original fairy tale. And that moment, Martin, you know, where they actually cut the toes off and the heels off, and the stage flooded with a red cloth and then disappeared again. And I've got those three memories very clearly in my mind. And I then got hooked by this genre, this thing called theatre. And then, like many people and listening to the previous podcasts, got involved with school dramas and youth theatres. That then took me into university, into the profession. But I can clearly trace it back to three productions that I was taken to in my junior school years.
Panto, like so many other forms, children's theatre and so on, is so important to see young children sitting in an auditorium with their eyes wide open in awe and wonder of what's going on is a fantastic introduction to theatre and the arts in general.
I absolutely agree. I've got a memory of doing Cinderella a few years ago at Halifax at the Victoria Theatre for Imagine. And it was a little girl who came in all dressed up as Cinderella, and she was with, I don't want to say, I don't know, it might have been her dad or her uncle, but she was with a kind of a parental figure. And she just loved being that auditorium, being taken into that other world. And the reason I've got this memory is really clear for me, Martin, is that I don't think he wanted to be there to begin with. So the young girl had gone in wide-eyed, full of wonder of this world, and she was sucked into the story world. I remember it clearly. I was sitting a couple of rows behind in the circle. And at the beginning, he had his arms folded. By the end of Act 1, when that coach and horses starts to fly over the auditorium, you know that sequence, Martin, yeah. Just beautiful. And we created a snow effect through that, so it's flying through snow. and she was waving at Cinderella. Cinderella was, in her mind, was waving directly back to her, not the other 1,500 people, to her. You could really sense that she felt that strong connection with that character. But also, the person that she'd come with was waving as well and was just as involved in the story and in the magic and in this other world. And that's just one of many stories I could tell about the absolute joy of seeing young people come into that auditorium and want to be taken on an adventure.
Well, do you know, that's something we rarely talk about. We often talk about how important it is for panto in terms of children going to see live theatre. But there are many times, I'm sure, where the only reason parents will go to a theatre, for the first time possibly, certainly for many years, is to take their children. And that's important too.
It is. And then I find it starts to become a mini ritual for that family, that they can see that their children or the family that they're with, because it is a family genre, isn't it? It's not a children's genre. It's very much a family genre, and you've got to play to everybody in the house. But absolutely, the first time that they go, and then I do speak to many people who say now it's become just part and parcel of their Christmas routine, and they go every year to the pantomime.
Now, I know you as a director. I think we worked together in 2009, but you are so many things these days. You're an academic, you're a writer as well, and you've directed all over the country. Which came first, Rob? Were you first and foremost a director who became an academic, or the other way round?
A director who became an academic. I went to university. I studied drama at the University of Wales in Aberystwyth, thinking that I would study drama, and then I wanted to become an actor. I thought I will go and do a one-year postgraduate at a drama school. I then fell into this thing called directing. There were a couple of directing modules, and that was happening at exactly the same time. I was in productions at university, and there were some fabulous people in my year group. There were people like Craig Ells, who's now gone on to become Miss Trunchbull in the RSC's Matilda and so on. Fabulous sets of people who've gone off into the industry. And I knew then that I wasn't good enough to be an actor. But these directing modules taught me that I loved the acting process. I loved working with actors. I loved rehearsing. I loved being on the rehearsal room floor, exploring and really empowering the actors to do their best. And that's what I then started to do. So I didn't go into postgraduate training as an actor. I set up my own theatre company. I had a wonderful opportunity to start assisting in regional repertory theatre. I had some lovely gates open to me in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I was assistant directing. I was creating my own work through my own theatre company, got a grant from the Prince's Trust, started doing Charlie's Aunt and some kind of mainstream comedies. And then I was invited to, as part of all of that journey, I was working at the New Vic in Stoke at the time. And I mentioned the New Vic earlier in seeing Cinderella. It's been a big part of my formative years, and was invited to guest direct at the university, at Staffordshire University, and to guest direct at Arden School of Theatre and a couple of other drama schools in Manchester. And I fell into academia. I was invited back, and 16 years later, I'm now head of Department of Media and Performance at Staffordshire. And I'm very lucky. I've been able to maintain my freelance professional career, and that feeds back into the curriculum, making sure that the curriculum is current, and I can feed ideas that I'm exploring in that space back into the professional rehearsal room.
And it's a variety of stuff that you've directed as well. You know, again, I only know you through Panto, but you've done so many different things, haven't you?
I have, and someone asked me about this recently, but what the core of it is theatrical theatre, if that makes sense, Martin. Mm-hmm. And I think it goes back to those three productions that I mentioned earlier, that Cinderella and Aladdin and The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. My aesthetic has always been the love of the theatrical, the love of the spectacle. It's probably why I love pantomime in that way. So I'm very keen on, not necessarily always Brechtian, where you know it's theatre, but I'm very keen on the spectacle of theatre. I've gone away in the last decade from kind of uber-realistic, uber-naturalism of like Ibsen and Chekhov and so on. But musicals, pantomimes, Shakespeare, and I got involved a little bit in teaching opera. Again, that sense of size size and a sense of theatricality that you can't replicate on the screen, that you can't replicate it in cinema and television, but what it's like to share a space with another group of people, i.e. the performers, and really tell a story in a theatrical and dynamic way.
A couple of things that you reminded me of there. I think you mentioned Brecht, and I am a big fan of Bertolt Brecht. Seldom performed these days in this country, at least.
Yes.
And I've done a couple of Brecht plays, Caucasian Chalk Circle and Mother Courage. But my favourite, and I think the time is right to bring this one back, is The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui, because it's a warning to us all, whichever country you live in, about what can happen. And the other thing is, you're talking about the spectacle, and you remind me, I spent some years ago, when I was doing my degree, watching and working alongside Michael Bogdanov at the National Theatre. And he just loved the spectacle of theatre. And you remind me, from what you said, of his sort of philosophy. Absolutely.
I think Bogdanov, again, through his work in Shakespeare, I think he did a Mods and Rockers Romeo and Juliet, I'm sure, at the RSC. How do we tell that story? It's interesting, going back to what you're talking about in relation to Brecht there, Martin. Theatre has the most amazing power to make sense of the world around us. Sometimes that can be done really powerfully and boldly, like in Arturo Ui that you mentioned, and Brecht. And other times you make sense of the world around us through the stories you tell, thinking, gosh, what would I do in that situation? What might I do? Or you make sense of the world around you by going to see a panto or a musical where you're taken out of yourself for 2 hours and might be reminded, whatever's going on in your life, what it means to be human and to connect with the people that you've come with, and to connect with the story, to laugh for a couple of hours and so on, and to have a good night out. So absolutely, I think when you're directing, you've got to think, what kind of director do I want to be? What stories do I want to tell? What's my aesthetic? What's the spectacle, and what's the design, and what's the aesthetic that how I want to tell these stories through and with.
There are elements of all sorts of aspects of theatre in panto, even Shakespeare, which I know that you've studied an awful lot and directed. Not so much Chekhov, which I think you've done an awful lot with as well. But I wonder, for anybody who's listening to this, even those who work in the business, how do you approach directing a panto? Do you come at it with fresh eyes each and every time, or do you have a sort of preset formula in your head?
Gosh, that's interesting. I think I always come to the pantomime rehearsal room, and I say this on day one, it's my first day talk, that we have to treat it as if it's a new piece. We've got to treat it that the children in the auditorium don't necessarily know the story. You've got to feel that when Snow White is about to bite into that apple, that it could go in two directions. Maybe by us crying out that we'll stop the action and she won't bite the apple. We've got to get to that crossroads and fresh mint the story each time, even though most of us know the story and we know how it's going to end. We still need to play it that in that moment something different might happen. And that's really key for me to keep it fresh. Not patronising the audience and so on. There's ingredients for me that make up pantomime, Martin, and you could take some of these ingredients out and it wouldn't be pantomime, but you might add a new ingredient in, or you might put less or more in of these ingredients, and you can push the form in a slightly different direction, but it's still a pantomime. I was thinking about this recently for something else, and for me there's kind of seven ingredients. There's kind of the music and dance, there's the magic, there's the moral, which leads on to the story, which leads on to the anarchy, which leads on to the spectacle, and then there's the audience, the ingredients of the audience. So for me, there's those 7 elements, and they're more or less in every pantomime. But what I don't say is we don't get fixed on, the dame always has to be male, for example, or to that level of specificity. That's part of the story and the characters involved in the story. There should be a dame, in my belief, and there's question marks, aren't there? If you take the dame out, is it still a pantomime? pantomime. I've seen a couple of pantomimes, Snow White in particular, where there hasn't been a dame, and I felt I've missed something. I felt that ingredient wasn't there in the story. There wasn't that foil, that anarchic, mumsy figure who could do outrageous things. Was it still a pantomime? Yes, it was, but a key ingredient was missing, and it didn't taste or feel or sense the same.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, but I totally agree with you. I mean, there have been some notable women who have played Dame, and as that maternal figure, with comedy and slapstick and so on, there is absolutely no reason why it has to be a man. There is some sort of comedy that you can get out of a man playing it, but you can get different comedy out of it if it's played by a woman.
That's it. And if there's still the dynamic there, if there's still someone to initiate the anarchy, to respond outrageously to situations, I think that's really key. Another thing that I'm really keen on approaching in a rehearsal room is what's the balance between the story and the anarchy, the story and the spectacle. I think one of your previous guests was talking about it. You write one line, but you can make a bridge between the story that you're in and maybe this anarchic routine that you're about to go into. That's really key for me, that you've got to have that balance. You've got to know when to rein it in. You've got to know, for example, who can do that with the audience, who can't. So there's those rules that are there to frame the pantomime experience. Otherwise, it's messy. It's a blur. I saw a pantomime once, the venue and company will remain nameless, whereas the story had all finished by the end of Act 1. And in Act 2, they went into several routines, all really fabulous routines in their own right. I remember there was the mirror routine, there was the balloon ballet, there was the bench routine, the behind you routine. But the kids were running up and down the aisle. The story had been lost so much that there was nothing to anchor them to these vaudevillian set routines. If the story had been constructed differently into Act 2 and you'd woven those routines in, I think you would have held then everybody in that auditorium, because you've got to hold everybody. The adults were watching these routines and loving it, but then you had lost the younger demographic. So there's a real skill to the writing of pantomime and the construction of the pantomime itself prior to even when you then get into rehearsals and you have to make that work on the rehearsal room floor.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear what you might have to say about actors who may come to panto for the very first time, particularly the story-based characters, not so much, the baddie, the Abenazer or the dame or the comic who will step out of the panto, walk down the apron and address the audience, but for those who are story-based, because it's really important, I think, that although it's only panto, as some people might think, you have to be true to the story. The truth has to be evident. It has to be believable, doesn't it?
It so does. And I had a little chill when you said, you mentioned that some people say only panto, and I hear that. Less so now, Martin. I'm sure you agree. I think that the genre's had a resurgence and there's an energy over the last decade and a half, I think. But certainly in terms of young performers, and I love it when I see some of the drama schools and musical theatre colleges having a module on pantomime, but they're few and far between, really. I know MTA and DSL, amongst many others, do pantomime, and one of the reasons that we're developing a master's programme in pantomime at Staffordshire University is to support the training of artists in the genre moving forward. But yeah, it's incumbent on the director, actually, to work with performers who haven't necessarily had that training in drama school, to work with them in rehearsals. Time is finite in rehearsals, as you know, in pantomime, but you still have to train, nurture and encourage. Many years ago, I was really aware and thinking that it's not their fault that they haven't done this in drama school or in their musical theatre training. It's up to me, actually, within the first few days to say, actually, no, you're aware of the audience, but you don't break that wall. You're aware of the audience, you can open up and do all of that, but no, you must keep within the story. And I think that's a real challenge, I think, those story characters, because there's a human need to kind of want to pull out and over the footlights and start to interact. But again, it's what I was saying about earlier. If everybody starts to do that, then it's messy, then it's homogenous, and the clarity goes. I am linked into those anarchy characters, and you can have story characters who are in the anarchy. You might have a completely anarchic scene, but you've got these two, like, I often think sometimes in the Dick Whittington story, you have an anarchic moment, but the story characters of Dick and Alice are keeping their journey alive and present in that tiny moment where the dame and the comic are doing something absolutely bizarre around them. But that's the joy of the genre, I think. That's the absolute joy of pantomime, that spectacle. But yes, you're right. It's about working in the rehearsal room to support performers. And similarly, when people cross over. So, if someone may have been a principal boy for a while and then gone into the baddie role, or someone goes from comic into dame, again, it's up to the director to support that transition. So I do think really healthy rehearsal rooms are getting the show on, creating West End standard productions, but also supporting and nurturing and make sure the genre is pushed and it's flexed as well, but also make sure the genre is protected by encouraging and nurturing in the rehearsal room.
Absolutely. And that truth and that reality is certainly, as far as the kids are concerned in particular, ties into the moral as well, which is a key to every panto. What about the last 18 months or so, Rob? What have you been able to do? I guess more so as an academic than a director.
I've been very privileged, Martin, in my work that I freelance direct, but I'm also an academic as well. So in the last 18 months, I've taught directing online. I never thought I'd be doing that. Been directing Shakespeare online, but really supporting my colleagues and the students to think about how they might work in a digital environment. The outgoing the head of arts at the BBC, John T. Claypole, was talking recently about the live and the digital are the live and media are closer than ever before. And we've got real opportunities, I think, to do things as well as, not instead of. For me, theatre is the live environment, sharing the live space and time. But we can get our stories told in a digital environment or live stream in a different way. I'm really interested to see where the pantomime genre might go in the digital environment, because that really depends for me on the live connection with the audience. But going back to kind of my work at the university, I've been incredibly impressed with the students' resilience. So they've moved from going to do a full-scale Shakespeare production, we're now moving it to do an audio drama, for example, at the cusp of the first lockdown. Again, we've had to move a musical theatre piece that was going to be done live. We were doing Mole Flanders, and that then had to be turned. We were going to then do that as a live radio, and then it became an audio musical. Or we've been thinking a bit like the BBC's Staged. How do we use the digital environments and the platforms congruously with what story we're going to tell? I think Staged did that brilliantly with Michael Sheen and David Tennant. They really use the format well. So we've been encouraging them to think around that. So when we have been doing monologues, and they've only, in the first lockdown in particular, or that one walk a day that they could do, one piece of exercise, where would you film this monologue? Where's the best place in your home to do that? Might it be under the stairs? Might it be in the garden? Might it be on that bench? So getting them to think about, we can't do it in a physical theatre space, but how can we be creative in the environment in which we're working at the moment? And I know you've touched on this before in other podcasts, that theatre is so resilient. It's always bounced back. When it was closed for nearly 20 years in the Puritan era, it came back stronger, bolder, more dynamic. Women then came onto stage. It came back in a way that we'd never anticipated. And I think that that COVID and lockdown has been horrendous for freelancers in particular, but it's also proved to me the tenacity and the resilience of our art form, how we can tell stories, how we can make work, and where we might go in the future.
Well, we'll talk about the future in a moment, actually, but we've got 3 final questions, which I've asked everybody on the podcast, as you know. The first being, Rob, what's your favourite title?
When I'm working on a title, that's always my favourite, because I invest in it completely and I love it. But there's one title that I keep coming back to. It was my first title with Imagine, then Wish, and it's a story that keeps coming back to me in different ways as well, and that's Beauty and the Beast. I think it's got everything in it. It's got a really strong story. It's full of music and choreography. It's full of magic. It's full of transformation. It's got a really strong moral, how we deal with our own prejudices and the outsider, and the notion of the outsider, and how we deal with that. And Beauty and the Beast has come to be my favourite title.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there is an extra twist in that. At the start, who's the baddie? Is it Gaston?
Yes.
Or is it the Beast? The Beast eventually turns around and we know why he's a baddie initially because of the way he's been treated. But, there's a moral in that as well, isn't there?
Totally. And it's how we perceive other people and how we deal with that. I think that's it. And we don't push that down audiences' throats. It's really important, isn't it? But how we look at who's the baddie in our own lives. Am I the baddie in my own story? How do I make amends for what I do? How do I treat other people? That's a really strong story to engage with for those reasons.
Okay, when was it not all right on the night, Rob?
Do you know, as a director, I leave on the first night, as you know, and then I get to read the show reports, which the deputy stage manager then sends through to the. I'm sure most of your listeners will know, but through to the creative team and the producers and so on, and we keep the show on track through that and pick up any things that might need tweaking. And you think, oh gosh, you're reading a show report and it's saying that in the song sheet, a child has exposed themselves, but the comic kept going and managed to rescue the situation. And you think, oh my word, and then you have to deal with that and come back in. When was it not all right on the night when I've been actually in the auditorium? I was sat with the producer, Sarah, one of the producers of Imagine, and we were between the matinee and the evening of Aladdin in Halifax. And the comic hits his head coming out of the washing machine and starts to look a little bit dizzy and came back on in the next act cross-eyed. And I got to the end of the piece, went backstage immediately. He'd been whisked to hospital, and I remember Sarah saying, well, I think, Rob, you're probably going to be on for the 5 o'clock. So I took my script, I texted the actor, hoping he was all right, of course, but secretly thinking, just please come back. I took my script to a local cafe, cramming some lines. Luckily, he came back 10 minutes before, so I could stand down, and he went on, and everything was fine. But those moments where your heart beats, your heart skips a beat, and you think, am I going to be on as a director here? I know it quite well, but I'm not the comic, and I know I'll probably get that booing if they announce it as a pre-show announcement. The part of so-and-so is played by. I don't think I'd go down very well.
That would have been really interesting for the rest of the company, because the other actors would be going, what's he doing? He didn't direct that.
Yes, he did. He said he didn't tell us to do it like that.
Now, you talked about the future, but the final question has to be, why is Panto so special for you? And as an academic, why is it so endearing and so enduring in the 21st century?
Gosh, yeah, two sides to that, Martin. I think as a human being, I think like good theatre, done best, Panto has the ability to, where you go into that auditorium as an individual, but you come out as part of a collective. And it goes back to that story I was saying earlier about the young girl and the parental figure that she came in. They went out holding their hands together into that interval. They came out as one, where they came in slightly in an individual manner. That's what pantomime can do for me. It can unite, it can celebrate what it means to be human, because everything that's on that stage is we have quests to go on, we have adventures to go on, we take bold leaps in our lives. We all are secretly wanting to be anarchic. Licensed transgression, Millie Taylor calls it as an academic. We want to transgress like the Dame and the comic do. We want to say those outrageous things and do those outrageous things and throw those custard pies in the faces of the people that we're not getting on with in that moment. But we don't. We take a breath. So for me, pantomime has that beautiful ability to think, gosh, I'd love to be in that world. I'd love to go on that adventure. I'd love to say and do those things. But I don't always do. But I might go out and say, I might take that risk. I might take that job that potentially I wasn't going to. I might go on my own quest.
As an academic, what's the secret of Panto's success?
Marvin Carlson, who's an academic, talks about this notion of ghosting. What Carlson means by that is that we're ghosted by previous pantomimes. There's an expectation. So for me, Panto has lived and endured because of those 7 ingredients I was talking about earlier. They may shift, they may change, you may tell the story in a different way. The Dame may not be played by a male. There may be a twist to the story at the end. but essentially the ingredients are the same. The audience come in knowing what to expect, and then the joy is, and the secret is not what story you're telling, but how you tell that story differently, what surprises you might give the audience. And that's to do with the writing and the directing and the actors and in the rehearsal room and the pre-production and so on. How do we take those expectations? You may come and see Cinderella third or fourth time as a family over 20 years. What are we going to do new now? Martin, you've played the same venues, haven't you, for big chunks at Loughborough and now at Leicester. And people will come with an expectation, come with a warmth, knowing Martin, knowing what you're going to potentially give them. And then the surprise is, what's he going to do this year? Might he do something a bit different? How's...
No,
but
same tired old act.
Never. But knowing that there are those feel safe in that environment, but then you can push it and you can take the audience further. So I think ghosting is really important. You know that you're going to come and do a ghost routine. You know you're going to come and see some slapstick, and you get used to the venue, you get used to the production company, you get used to the performers and what they're going to do, and then you can take them on a slightly crazy adventure within that safe framework.
I think as well, Rob, that COVID-19 has given us all an opportunity to take stock of our lives. It's also given theatre an opportunity to take a long, hard look at itself, and pantomime as well. It's always evolved, right from commedia dell'arte through to the 21st century, and it has to continue to evolve. Lots of things are being discussed at the moment: stereotyping, cultural sensitivities, diversity of casting, and so on. So I wonder where you think the next evolution of panto might take it.
I think you're right. I think with the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, we're questioning who we are as human beings, aren't we? And pantomime, it doesn't sit outside of that. It's always evolved, as you said. So I'm really keen to see where we go next. Simon Sladen said on a previous podcast, didn't he, I think, about, one of the questions is, what do we do with Aladdin now? If we believe that the story is one that we still want to tell, the question is then, as practitioners, is okay, how do we tell that story? How do we do that through the casting and maybe the lived experience of that? How do we present otherness as well? Pantomime is always about otherness. The baddie, there has to be a threat in order to go on the quest. So how are we going to approach that? How do we make sure that we're looking at archetypes and not stereotypes? How do we make sure that we're not... For example, there's been a big shift over many years in terms of physical humour as well. You used to see a lot of slapstick, often male to female as well. It doesn't feel, it's not comfortable, it doesn't feel right. There's not a rightness with any of that. So if we do use physical slapstick, how do we do it? How does it feel comfortable? If we still think, actually, we still need that physical anarchy, let's make sure that we're balancing that correctly. So I think pantomime is going through, and a lot of the producers are going through a period of reflection at the moment, and practitioners are as well, and it's incumbent on us to make sure that we're moving forward and that we're reflecting that pantomime reflects the society that we're in. It always has done. I mean, in the 1800s, the giant was called Giant Russia, I think, in one of the Manchester, when there was the threat of Russia at one stage. Giant Russia. We've had the otherness and poking fun at Donald Trump. It reflects the world that we're in, and therefore these questions that we're going through at the moment in terms of how we tell stories like Aladdin, where do we go in Dick Whittington, and how do we make sure things aren't archetypal? That's just part and parcel of making sure that we're reflecting the world that we're in now.
Rob, I'm afraid we've run out of time and we haven't even had a chance to talk about your writing. I know you've had some interesting projects over the last couple of years, The Snow Queen, The Prince and the Pauper and so on. Before we finish though, what are you directing for Christmas 2021?
I'm so excited to be back in Halifax this year with Jack and the Beanstalk. This will be my kind of 11th panto up in Halifax. I've done kind of 25 years of panto, and I'm just thrilled to be back with old friends and new, and telling that story.
I think everybody's looking forward to the return of panto up and down the country this Christmas. I wish you all the very best for your season in Halifax, Rob, and thank you so much for talking to us.
I've loved it, Martin. It's been great.
And that's about it, I'm afraid, from episode 13. Don't forget you can subscribe through your favourite podcast app. app. Make sure you do that right now and join me, Martin Ballard, next time when I'll be talking to the stage and television actor, Imagine's resident dame at the Royal Spa Centre in Leamington Spa, and you may also know him as his drag alter ego Mary Mack. JP McHugh is my guest next time on episode 14. I'll see you then.
Thank you for listening to the latest edition of Just Imagine, the podcast series from Imagine Theatre. And you can find out more by going to www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.